Welcome to Open Matters, an interview series designed to explore the intersection of open source and open standards with folks in our industry. I'm your host, Guy Martin, the Executive Director of OASIS Open. In today's discussion, we're going to cover building a hybrid standards development and open source consortium. It's been quite a hot topic, both for what we are trying to do here at OASIS and also for many public and private sector organizations, especially in Europe. So public sector and government organizations have traditionally favored standards, but they're increasingly looking to open source to help them lead digital innovation for citizens. And they rely on consortiums and other industry groups to help them work effectively with diverse vendors, as well as the standards and open source communities. We'll talk today about why and how you can build support for a converged open standards and open source ecosystem. Joining me today is Chris Ferris, IBM CTO of Open Technology and an IBM Fellow. And in addition to serving on the OASIS Open Projects Advisory Council, Chris has a long history in open source in areas such as web standards and blockchain. He's also been around the block a time or two in the standards field. In short, we think he's the perfect person to give his perspective on why open source and open standards should be working together. Thanks for being on the show, Chris.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Great. So real quick before we get going, some quick housekeeping items. Questions will be held till the end, and attendees may raise their hand to ask their question live or to insert a question into the Q&A box. And a quick reminder for everyone that this session is being recorded for later playback. So with that out of the way, let's get started. Chris, what is your view of a hybrid standards definition and open source organization? And why do you think so many organizations are trying to do this?
So I think, again, one of the, if you will, the dings against open standards is that they take so long to develop. You have, I think, I may have I worked with Paul Cotton from Microsoft and co-chairing the WS policy working group at W3C back in the day when we were doing web services standards. And we actually had we had an input specification that didn't change all that much, but it took us 18 months to get it fully ratified as a W3C recommendation. And then you start rolling out the implementations and you have to hammer away at the interoperability and so forth. So, you're really talking a couple of years before you really have in the market, you have interoperable implementations of the new standard. And at the rate and pace of innovation increasingly, especially in the cloud era, we're starting to see, cycles of 6 months where there's new innovation coming on board. And we don't really have the luxury of waiting a couple of years for something to establish a standard before it starts getting implemented and adopted by industry. And so I think what people started to do is to look at open source as an effective substitute, if you will, for a formally recognized and engineered and adopted either industry or international standard. But again, that's not enough, right? As you mentioned, especially in like Europe and in Asia, and with some governments, they rely on and they have in their code, they have requirements for adoption of standards. And so, what I think people are looking at is, can we get to this sort of happy medium where we're doing open source development practices, but then taking the output of that as here's a formal snapshot of the implementation of something, let's say, like Kubernetes, taking the APIs and formalizing those as a standard, right? And working that up through the POS submitter status that I know OASIS and Linux Foundation and other organizations, Eclipse, have now with the formal de jure standards bodies. So we move past just having a de facto standard in the market, and we can actually establish a de jure standard but with less time between the actual thought process of, I want to get a standard for X and actually delivering it to the market.
Right. And for those that may not know, de jure standards are basically standards built with collaborative processes and collaborative consortiums like OASIS and others, whereas de facto were things like Microsoft Office or things that may have just been been become the
Widely
standard
adopted.
through wide adopted use.
Yeah.
So, and you just mentioned, you said that formal de jure standards by a lot of people in the open source world, I think especially, are sometimes viewed as an impediment because like you said, the innovation takes so long, and these things hold sway for years over the technology base, which kind of gets to the interoperability piece, which we're going to cover in a sec. But and you sort of mentioned this, but can you dig a little deeper on how you think this kind of an effective dash of open source may potentially help fix that, or kind of get us to that happy medium you talked about?
So I think, again, if you think about the sort of the process for developing a standard, it typically involves developing a specification in prose, whether it's English or some other language, and sometimes with more formal type languages. And so the discussion is very sort of intellectual. I mean, it's just thought process, right? So I think this will work, and you write it down on paper, and you hope that everybody interprets it the same way and implements it consistently. But you can also find that after a time, we start doing sort of early implementations of the standard, and we find, oh well, the performance isn't really that great. And so we have to go through and we have to tweak it again. And so, you go through these iterative cycles of that, and that can take time, right? And like I said, I mean, I think, like I said, I think Paul and I set the record within 18 months, from back of a napkin to published, W3C recommendation. Other standards like the ones we developed in OASIS, like WS reliable messaging and various other of the WS, standards took even longer, right, to get. And as a result, when you think about it, the whole web services sort of the web services industry basically collapsed and was replaced with JSON and REST, which none of them were standards, but everybody just got fed up waiting around for for the ink to dry on the WS specs, and as a result, they're not as relevant today as the REST and JSON and so forth. So again, I think you got it right, but I think what we want to do is get to the point where the process of developing a standard is following the sort of open source processes with constant implementation. So we're essentially building the standard alongside any writing, any prose development of a specification. Or you could even start with, let's just do some development, get something working, and then then we can define what is that API, and codify that, and then send that up through the process of becoming a standard. We don't have to wait around for everybody to agree on the English prose that represents what that API is. We can actually formalize it in in an open API document, for instance.
Right.
So those are the types of things I think that we need to be looking at as we go forward, and we're trying to develop interoperability protocols, especially that we take it from an implementation and create a standard out of that. But it's a standard that everybody can use immediately. So the other thing is, in the past, we would write these paper specifications, if you will, and everybody went off and implemented their own flavor, right? And they were all bespoke implementations, in somebody's development shop. And then you bring it out to market and you hope and pray that it does interoperate with everybody else, right? Whereas with open source, you're all starting from essentially reference implementation. Others are free to implement differently if they want, but at least everybody has the opportunity to immediately embrace and adopt that open source implementation and bring it to market. And so again, it speeds up the innovation process and the ability to get that innovation into the market.
Right. Do you think it hurts the interoperability in the long term, though? I mean, I know that the need for a TCK, you mentioned these bespoke implementations, but the need for a TCK to make sure that, after you've gotten to the point where you've gotten the API and you've used that as the bones of the standard, where do you think because I know that a lot of people in the open standards, very traditional open standards community, may give the argument of, it's great that we're doing all this iterative process, but whether the long-term interoperability, which is kind of where standards has made its name.
Yeah, so I think that's an interesting question. And I do think that that does tend to come out of the open source as well, even if it's not intending to become a formal standard, because there, you have the iterative process. And so, you can have projects that, issue new releases on, either a quarterly basis or even more frequently, potentially. And so the APIs and so forth can evolve over time. And then there's a question of, well, what about forwards and backwards compatibility and so forth? And eventually, especially in more mature projects, like Kubernetes or like OpenStack, for instance, or like Hyperledger Fabric, then there comes a time when the community basically says, well, we need to have some sort of a certification process so that we can assure that people that are going to market with these APIs are going to market with something that is consistent, and as well, and does provide that sort of forward and backward interoperability. So I think, again, more mature projects tend to operate in that way, and that actually could become the thing that gets standardized is are those the certification test suites that they publish. Again, it's going to depend on the maturity of the communities that we're engaged with. But I know that for instance, the open projects, that's their goal, right? So I think they're working with the right sort of mindset of
Right.
We recognize that we want to get to interoperability. We're going to have to produce something as a standard, but with an open implementation that we can send up and that is going to have some long-lasting effect in the market.
Right. Yeah. I mean, at Baseline, the open project we have, Baseline is doing a great job of that, right? Taking their API, using that again as the bones of the standard, like you talked about.
Right.
So, I mean, it's interesting. You covered a little bit there, sort of perceptions from both sides, and I think when I see this, I see a lot of perceptions and a lot of things being thrown back and forth, kind of between the standards community and the open source community, and looking at each other maybe with a little bit of wary eyes. What challenges do you think are the biggest ones in finding a way to merge or provide these cooperation points between the communities? I mean, some people say it's IPR, some people say it's culture. You mentioned pace. Others, where do we start beginning to find these cooperation points?
That's a good question. I think certainly the market itself is sort of looking for the stability. They want to see the innovation and so forth, but they also want stability. And it is interesting. I think in many open source communities, there's some expectation, everybody's keeping up with the latest release of XYZ, right? And, and then, I was just recently going through a situation where, some Python code that I had that I was using all the time, but it was written to 2 point something, right? That's deprecated now. And I was like, I got to bring it all up to, 3.0. So, it is an effort sometimes to move beyond, something that you had that was stable, and to sort of keep up with the Joneses. I think that industry is generally going to be looking for that stability. And I think that'll come from the ability to, again, to elevate something beyond just an open source implementation, but that is also treated as an international standard, so that we can say we want some stability on that particular implementation and that set of interfaces, and that can be something long-term, that the enterprises that adopt it can hope to rely on.
Right. So I think you're saying it's almost a customer-driven perspective here that you believe can sort of, I don't want to say force, but coerce or nudge vendors in the right,
it'll
open source project in the
influence
right direction.
Influence. Yeah, it'll influence. Yes, right.
No, that's great. I mean, and I think that's what we're all hoping, those of us in this space. And, there's been a lot written about this, and a lot of us participated in the Open Forum Europe Lounge series recently, where this was, again, a very, very hot topic. So, thanks for coming on, because this is very germane to what's going on right now. What concrete steps do you think industry consortia like OASIS and others can take to help move this forward? So, you mentioned sort of a perspective of customers driving this, but what do we, in kind of the industry consortia or the neutral bodies, what can we do to help move this forward?
I think that's so one thing would be to be engaged in sort of the open source community. And now again, OASIS is, you've got the open projects that have been, oh my goodness, are we coming up on 2 years, or is it 2 years?
Yeah, 2 years. So it was about
The
2
time
years.
flies. Of course, last year was, we're just all trying to forget it, right?
Yeah, we're just trying to forget last year if we can.
But but to be engaged in sort of in the open source community, I think is an important part of that, to have some initial successes with projects like Baseline, right? And OCA, for instance, again, two good examples. I think that will help to establish OASIS as an effective place to host open source projects that intend to have some measure of success and long-term interoperability. I think that's probably one effective way. Again, getting out the word. You mentioned early on that some in the open source community effectively sort of look down their nose at standards, because again, they think they take too long and so forth. And while there's a certain truth in that, but there is a value in those longer term standards. And having an open source, the other piece of it that is interesting is that there is always an opportunity with an open source project to basically take those APIs and hollow out the inside and put together a more performant or whatever implementation, write it in a different language or what have you. And that's where then it comes a need to actually have something that formalizes and says this is the formal API that you need to adhere to, that allows for the market to actually innovate sort of behind the curtain, if you will, right. Of an open standard. And so again, I tend to think that over time, communities, as they mature, they get to the point where they're doing the certification, they're doing essentially standardization work. They just don't call it that, right? Right. And I think getting that and then taking those initiatives like they're working on in Kubernetes, for instance, and taking it to the next level of elevating that as a POS submission to JTC1, for instance, I think would be a positive thing.
Right. And, it's interesting. I sort of mentioned that you mentioned a customer focus, but I think it's really important. And I saw this in my experience with the U.S. Department of Defense consulting, where standards were kind of the checkbox or the preferred mechanism. And governments especially are big on this. And so I look at this also as, it's great to have an international standard for all the reasons you mentioned, but it's also, I think, a little bit of an easier entree into some of these really highly regulated procurement pipelines, which, yes. I'm all for as an open source person, let's get more open source into government. I mean, there's been a lot of work that's happened since we did the Forge.mil effort in DoD, a lot of work, which has been great, but I'd like to see even more in there. And so I also see standards as a way to kind of get into those pipelines that maybe traditionally have been a little bit harder for open source.
But I also think, though, that some are also looking at open source and trying to figure out how do we make that more of a formally accepted thing, the way that you have with standards being sort of a checkbox, making it acceptable to have open source in the mix, if you will. But then there has to be some criteria, right? Because again, there's open source and then there's open source, right? I like to say, that a majority of the open source you find out on GitHub is the equivalent of furniture left by the side of the road, right? Where somebody has published something into a Git repo and that's the end of that, right?
Oh, yeah.
And
community health is a big thing.
And yes, you need to have, a nice diverse community that's active and, taking a look at pull requests and issues and dealing with vulnerabilities and backporting fixes and so forth. You want to have communities like that, but they're not all, not all open source projects are like that at all. And so there needs to be some means of both measuring that. But I keep encouraging, even, well, enterprise certainly, but also governments and sort of government agencies to get more involved in open source, right? There's no reason whatsoever that, the EU or the DoD or, the US government shouldn't be directly involved in the projects that they may be taking on strategically within, their own, if you will, enterprise. And
Right.
and again, I think it's through that type of, and again, participation doesn't mean you're contributing code necessarily. It could be documentation. It could just be participation in, sort of the development of new features and so forth, and providing requirements and the like. But being involved also means that you have certain influence in the direction that things are going. And if you think this needs the maturity of the equivalent of a standard by developing a TCK or some sort of a certification program around the open source itself, that is likely to come from, again, from the community of use that's looking for the stability of something like a certification program.
Right. I mean, and it's really interesting you mentioned that, because I think you've probably seen, our colleague Jacob Green from Moss Labs is helping really start this notion of OSPOs, or open source program offices, which traditionally have been, and I've run a couple of these in industry, but putting in OSPOs in governments so that they can have that place to have that kind of engagement. What do you think about that?
I think it's fundamentally important. It's another thing that I go and when I talk with clients and with government agencies and the like, that I encourage it. And it's important first to understand what it is that you're dealing with, right? I mean, you can't just sort of turn the spigot on and say, "Oh, go do open source," and enterprise, and then you find out that you're in deep trouble, because you adopted some project that has no community behind it, and so the software is full of bugs and vulnerabilities and nobody's around to fix it, and yet it's the heart and soul of something you've deployed in your enterprise. Right. That's not a good thing.
No.
So putting together an open source program office that both manages the sort of the consumption or the ingress, if you will, of open source, especially when it's going to be strategic, if it's going to be around for a long time, if we're going to build all of our user interfaces out of Angular, we should take a close look at that, right? Make sure that it's got
a good idea,
a good community behind it. If we're going to do all of our containers using Kubernetes, then we should take a close look at that. And then the other thing is to encourage the sort of the virtuous cycle of contribution back into the open source communities themselves. And program offices are typically very effective at doing that if they're set up correctly. But it's important because, again, we had the SolarWinds attack, recently on the supply chain, and the open source security supply chain, if you would, the security, I should say, of the open source supply chain is something that we all have to be mindful of. And again, an OSPO is in a good position to both, be monitoring and understanding what we have in our enterprise. And then when somebody does publish a SolarWinds kind of a vulnerability, you can address it immediately versus running around saying, "Do we have any of that in our enterprise?" That's
exactly.
Trying to sweep up after that problem, after it's been known, and spending the time to try and understand what you have is a little bit too late.
Right. Well, I mean, and that you talk about that as it relates to standards, right? I mean, the great work going on at NTIA, our friend Alan Friedman doing the work with SBOM, software bill of materials, which is also working with the CSAF standard that OASIS is building. So finding, not having to go find those things, but just knowing, right? Kind of as a software hygiene perspective, knowing what's in all of your code, whether it's proprietary or open source, I think is really, really important. And I think we're starting to see, this has been coming along for a while. SolarWinds, I think, was a little bit of the straw, maybe that broke that camel's back a little bit, so that people are going, we really need to know what's in all of our software, and we need a standard to actually know how to find that stuff.
Yep. Absolutely.
Cool. So it looks like we're coming up here on time. So I know we have probably some questions from the audience. There's one for sure here in the panel that I wanted to cover, or sorry, in the chat that I wanted to cover. Says interfaces to open source are the aspect that needs to be standardized, and you want implementations to evolve, which you talked about, Chris, but you need the interfaces not to degrade. So do you want to kind of cover how you think that we keep the interfaces from degrading?
Oh, you mean over time, having
Yeah.
the interfaces change once they've been, so
Right.
again, this is where, again, it takes a certain maturity to sort of go at the continuous evolution of a project, but with, sort of a, I don't know, I like to call it an enterprise mindset, understanding that your users aren't necessarily going to be able to continually upgrade, right? Even though that's what you might like them to do. And so, having projects that adopt sort of a long-term support strategy for a particular release or releases, I think is an important piece of it. And again, if we did have a standard, then you would hope, or I would hope, that would be sort of pinned to a long-term support release of the software that conforms to that standard. And that allows you to evolve beyond that. But again, then you have to be thinking about, how am I going to get the people that are on version 2 up to version 3 when the time comes? Right. And is there a path, or do they have to blow it all up and re-implement? Ideally, exactly. Again, with sort of, like you said, with sort of that enterprise mindset in place. Again, if you get to the maturity where you're issuing a standard on your APIs, then hopefully you're also at a maturity level where, if you are going to have upgrades, they can be rolling upgrades that are facilitated with some sort of a conversion process that doesn't require that you burn it all down and bring it back up.
Right, and that kind of backward forward compatibility that you mentioned earlier is really important in that space. So D, do we have any questions from the audience other than the one I just read?
Okay, so we did get a couple more. The first one is, a successful standard is a standard that gets widely adopted. Is a better approach to establishing standards to allow survival of the fittest of open source implementations to see which rise to the top, such as JSON and REST, and then establish standards around them?
Ooh, good question.
Yes.
Chris. Yeah. Chris says yes.
Yes to all of the above.
Yes, go ahead, Chris. I'll let you take that one.
Yeah, I mean, my take is that sometimes we would develop standards with the belief that if you build it, they will come, kind of a thing, right? And then they don't come, right? And then you can get the situation where those that are having to sponsor the development of those standards get skittish and say, well, the last time we did that, it didn't pay out and there's no implementation. And so, again, this is another aspect where you can actually get the implementation, get the market momentum, and then say, okay, now I'm going to do the investment that says I'm going to turn this into a formal standard by, again, developing the TCK and putting it together in such a way that we can ensure interoperability over time. But I wouldn't invest in that early if I didn't think that it was going to be a success. That's my take. So
yeah, I mean, it's interesting too, right? If you think about how forks happen in open source, right? I think part of that question is, are we getting to a point where we may have to fork the standard, right? Which basically, I think it's a lot more difficult to do that than it is in the open source world, because you've got a lot more things that are potentially relying on that for sort of long-term interoperability.
Yeah.
Okay,
so,
great.
So
go ahead, Dee.
we do have time for one more question, and this is kind of skinning the cat from the other direction, but very interesting. If standard uses the same tools and release pacing as traditional open source, why can't they be as agile and up to date with continuous improvements?
Now, I think you mentioned a little bit about this, Chris. I'm curious, right. Yeah, how you deal with kind of taking the best of open source and getting the standards folks to adopt some of those practices.
That's a good question. I tend to, and it was funny. I noticed a notice go out the other day from a blast from the past for me from the EBXML messaging work group, which I chaired way back in the day when OASIS and the UN were collaborating on EBXML, yeah. And I was just thinking to myself, oh my God, actually Arnaud Lahore, who's I'm sure you all know, coming to me says, "Oh my God, it's still going." And anyway, so that was just sort of the blast from the past. But obviously, it has evolved over time. I think, again, sometimes I find, and again, some may dig me for this, but I do tend to find that some things just become a career, right? And I'm not sure exactly how much EBXML messaging is going on still in this day and age, but nonetheless, there is still standards work going on. So it's one of the things that I look out, amongst the folk that I manage that are working and engaged in standards, is make sure that we aren't we aren't letting them sort of fall into the trap of just sort of having the evolution of the standard become a career, even though there's not really a lot of interest in moving any implementations forward to new versions. So I do think that that's an important thing to take into consideration. In terms of the evolution aspect of things, again, it's when you anoint something as a standard that I think is the critical piece of things. If you allow something to iterate as an implementation in the market and get the adoption first, and then say, okay, now we're ready to call that a standard so that it can be even more broadly adopted, I think that's a better approach.
Right. Yeah, no, that makes complete sense. So unfortunately, we're out of time, Chris, but thanks. It's great to have you join me, give your perspective as someone who's kind of had to navigate the waters of both open source and open standards in your career. So thanks a lot for joining us.
Yeah, my pleasure. A lot of fun.
Great job. Thank you.
So if you want to learn more about this or other topics, you can come find us at oasis-open.org. And let's definitely continue this conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @OASIS Open. Until next time, thanks for listening, everybody.